to be able to see a show or not.
It's nice because it's like really excessive that it's like really nice space and like they have beautiful like showers so like and I also to go pleasant to go and I also like you can also come in and go like before you're gonna have dinner or something and shower and everything.
Good evening, and welcome to the Graduate Center. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm the provost of the Graduate Center, and I have the privilege of opening tonight's event. For those of you who are new to the Graduate Center, I thought I'd say one or two words, and then I'll pass the podium over to Barbara. With nearly 4,500 students, 34 doctoral programs, and about 30 research centers and institutes, the Graduate Center of New York City University brings together graduate education, advanced research, and public programming at our landmark home here in Midtown. We educate leading scholars of tomorrow. We advance scholarship in and across disciplines ranging from anthropology to urban education, and we disseminate knowledge throughout the world in a variety of ways. We're one of the nation's largest doctoral granting institutions in the humanities and the social sciences, second or third, depending on the year, to Berkeley and UCLA, occasionally University of Texas at Austin, sometimes Columbia. Our distinguished and diverse faculty of 1,900 is drawn from across the City University system. We're committed to advancing knowledge by reaching out to the horizons of learning and nurturing an academic environment in which scholarship seeks the broader and deeper understanding that's possible when the barriers of academic disciplines are lifted. That's what the spiel says anyway. In fact, I think I wrote this a couple of years ago. It is a great pleasure to have you. I'm never really persuaded by the utility of having me or the president stand here and open these events because you're keen to hear our speakers, not to hear me. But I'm told that occasionally it provides an imprimatur for the institution's endorsement. Not that this needs such an endorsement. This is a terrific series of lectures. We're deeply indebted to Constance Old for having provided the resources necessary. We're deeply indebted to the work that Barbara does at the center. And I wish you a delightful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chase, and good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Dobbs-McKenzie, and I'm the director of the Brooks Center for Music Research and Documentation. It's my great pleasure to join Chase in welcoming you to our program this evening. This is the second in our series, in our annual series of lectures called Music in 21st Century Society. First, let me briefly introduce our center to you. The Brooks Center is a scholarly facility closely associated with the doctoral programs in music here at the Graduate Center. Its objectives are to promote and provide a setting for wide-ranging research and documentation activities in music, and to disseminate the results of its activities to the scholarly community and the world at large through publications, conferences, exhibitions, and lectures. To give you an idea of what we do at the Brooks Center, in addition to this lecture series, here are the projects we are currently working on. Realm Abstracts of Music Literature, which is the premier index to scholarly writings about music from around the world. The Research Center for Music Iconography, which focuses on the study of music history through representations in art. The Foundation for Iberian Music. Music in Gotham, which is chronicling musical life in New York City in the second half of the 19th century. The Center for the Study of Free Reed Instruments. The Xenakis Project of the Americas. The Seminars of the Ensemble for the Romantic Century. the French and Francophone Musical Cultures Project, which is our latest edition. And last but not least, Music in the 21st Century, the Lloyd Old and Constance Old Lectures, of which tonight's event is, as I say, the second. This series aims to present talks and debates by major cultural figures addressing the changing consumption, creation, contexts, and valuations of music in today's society. The series is inspired and supported by Constance Old and her brother, the late Dr. Lloyd Old. For years, the Olds shared a passion and curiosity about the role of music in contemporary society, and this series is an outgrowth of that interest. Sadly, Dr. Old died in 2011, a few months before the series was inaugurated last April by Charles Rosen. And while he is sorely missed, not only is Constance Old here, but she has worked hard behind the scenes to support and to make this series a reality, and I would like to acknowledge her, as Chase also did now. Constance, thank you. And I'd also like to thank Anthony Pizza and Emmy Williamson, who have worked very hard on tonight's event, and the music programs here at the Graduate Center who are our partners tonight. So now onto the main event. Let me outline the way the evening will proceed. After I introduce tonight's speakers, Paul Griffiths will present his talk, What We Are, What We Hear. And after that, we will hear a short 15-minute program of music related to the talk. And following this, Jeff Milarsky will join Paul Griffiths on the stage for a conversation. By the way, just so you all know, not only is this event being presented to you, the people that are here live in the auditorium, but it's also being streamed by video over the internet. And I know there are quite a few people watching it that way, so welcome to them also. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening, which I will do in reverse order of when they appear on the stage. Jeff Milarsky is a leading conductor of contemporary music, known worldwide for his impeccable musicianship and innovative programming. He's conducted his wide-ranging repertoire spanning Bach to Xenakis with such accomplished groups as the San Francisco Symphony, American Composers Orchestra, Los Angeles Philharmonic, New York City Opera, Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, the New York Philharmonic, Tanglewood, and I could go on, many others. In the United States and abroad, he has premiered and recorded works by many groundbreaking contemporary composers in venues such as Carnegie Hall, Zankel Hall, Alice Tully Hall, Walt Disney Hall, Symphony Hall in Boston, and IRCAM in Paris. A dedicated pedagogue, Jeff Milarsky is the artistic director and conductor of the percussion ensemble at Manhattan School of Music and senior lecturer in music at Columbia University, where he is the music director and conductor of the Columbia University Orchestra, and the music director of Axiom, the Juilliard School's contemporary music ensemble. In addition, he conducts the Juilliard Orchestra and serves on the conducting faculty there. He is much in demand also as a timpanist and percussionist, having performed and recorded with the New York Philharmonic, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the Pittsburgh Symphony, among others, and has been principal timpanist for the Santa Fe Opera since 2005. We are delighted to have Jeff Milarsky with us this evening. Paul Griffiths is a name I have known since I began graduate studies in musicology at the University of Michigan back in the mid-1980s, dare I admit it. A required textbook for us was his book, Modern Music, the Avant-Garde since 1945, published in 1981, and still, through 2 more editions, an iconic book about modern music. I still have it at home on my shelf, and I can't hear the name Paul Griffiths without picturing that bright red book cover and all the compelling reading that it contains. It has been required reading for students of modern music for over 30 years now. But this iconic book only scratches the surface of Paul Griffiths' endeavors and impact. His career includes stints on the editorial staff of the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, as the chief music critic for The Times, music critic for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Times Literary Supplement. He has written, in addition to the book already mentioned, a number of important reference books and monographs, mostly about 20th century composers and their music, but also a history of the string quartet, The Penguin Companion to Classical Music, and a concise history of Western music. Paul Griffiths is also a novelist, publishing his first novel in 1989 called Myself and Marco Polo, a Novel of Changes, which won the 1990 Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the best first novel in the Europe and South Asia region. 2 years later, he published his second novel, The Lay of Sir Tristram, a retelling of the Tristan and Isolde legend. In Griffiths' most recent novel, Let Me Tell You, Ophelia tells her story in a first-person narrative using only the 481-word vocabulary given to her in Shakespeare's Hamlet. And his endeavors don't stop there. He also writes opera librettos, and very successfully. Griffiths' first libretto was The Jewel Box, which used music from Mozart's unfinished operas, Lo Sposo dell'Uso and L'Oca del Cairo, as well as other arias and ensembles. The story imagines a reconstruction of a pantomime in which Mozart and Aloysia Weber, a soprano who is also Mozart's sister-in-law, are said to have taken part in 1783. His second work of this type, Aeneas in Hell, was set to songs and dance music from Purcell's theater scores and was devised as a prequel to that composer's 1689 opera Dido and Aeneas. And he wrote the libretto for Tan Dunn's Marco Polo and for Elliott Carter's opera, What Next? I'll just say one more word about Paul Griffiths and the way he communicates about contemporary music. He isn't just reading and writing and talking about it from a kind of academic distance. Instead, he lives actively within the arena of modern music as it is composed and performed. This direct, first-hand agency, I think, is reflected in his very compelling and clear communication, both when writing and when speaking. This unique ability to transmit complex ideas and issues compellingly and understandably is what you are about to experience yourself. There's far more to say, but if I keep saying it, you won't get to hear the person you came to hear tonight. So let me stop and welcome to the stage Paul Griffiths.
Thank you all, and thank you, Barbara Mackenzie, for that introduction, which I hope I'm worthy of to about 10% of the level. But thank you, and thank you, Chase Robinson, for your introduction, which made me feel at once, well, increased my feeling of gratification and intimidation to be entering such a distinguished institution as this one. I also want to thank Anthony Pizar, who is the prime mover to invite me here, and of course Constance Old for making the whole series possible. Just under 3 weeks from now, we'll be celebrating the centenary of that stormy night in Paris, nothing to do with the weather, when an audience was first exposed to the rite of spring. Just over a month ago, we passed the centenary of another event, always less remembered, but hardly less noisy or momentous, the evening in Vienna, when a concert that Arnold Schoenberg was conducting had to be abandoned, the public's impatience being elicited this time not by massive pulsation and its attendant choreographic strangeness, but by a couple of songs luminously setting poetic capsules of intimacy and irony, songs from Alban Berg's Altenburg Lieder, songs whose charm was misunderstood on that first outing as feeble-mindedness, and whose atonal harmony was perhaps not understood at all. And there's also another centenary that passed recently. From the month of Schoenberg's concert, March 1913, Luigi Russolo published a manifesto calling for composers to abandon not only traditional rhythm and traditional harmony, but also traditional instruments, to create what he called the art of noises. From what we can gather, Russolo's theories and his concerts were not met with outrage, but they did receive its like-minded obverse, amusement and condescension. However, this series of lectures is called Music in 21st Century Society, so why do I begin by recalling these moments from deep back in the century before? 2 reasons. First, because the problem, and let's agree that we're talking about a problem, goes back to that time around 100 years ago when the relationship between composers' intentions and audiences' expectations reached a critical point in its journey from concord to dissonance. We can go back a century more and find a composer, Beethoven, whose music sometimes dumbfounded his listeners, but even his late works were received with respect and even enthusiasm. His Opus 127 string quartet, for instance, was played several times in Vienna within the few weeks after its premiere. Contrast that with the history of the Altenburg Lieder, none of which were performed anywhere again until 1952. My second reason for beginning with the uproars of 1913 has to do with the last word in the series title for these lectures, society, because at least the outbursts in Paris and Vienna that year prove that there indeed was a society and that this music had very definitely come into it, however unwelcome the arrival may have been. And of course, these once revolutionary works have stayed around, otherwise we'd not be talking about them. The Rite of Spring is probably having more performances just now than usual on account of its centenary, but it's long been turning up pretty regularly, probably every few seasons for most orchestras. And though Berg's Altenburg Lieder are no doubt a lot rarer, they still have a place in the vast region beyond the standard repertory, the comet belts from which such pieces swing in every now and then for their moment of glory. However, I've just introduced the term standard repertory that we may be wary of handling without scare quotes, as wary indeed as we may feel we have to be in the case of another term I've already used and have had to use at the behest of the series title, society. Once there was, or seems to have been, a unitary society. Once there was, or seems to have been, a unitary notion of music. Once there was, and I think really was, such a thing as the standard repertory, which musical people, as members of that part of society for which music is an essential of life, would recognize and have some acquaintance with as a matter of course. Now, all this may be rose-spectacled fantasy, but it cannot entirely be so because we have these terms, notably music and society, terms that the terms of these lectures want us to associate, and that I believe are associated, and yet we know that they apply rather poorly and even increasingly poorly to the conditions of today. What we see around us is not so much a society with widely agreed ideals and purposes as a balance of multitudinous conflicting interests, with some of the conflicts well under wraps, others unconcealed. And what we hear around us may be, yes, music, music everywhere, in cabs, in shoe stores, out of our mobile devices, but certainly not music that acknowledges any single tradition or hierarchy of traditions. Our music, like our society, is a dense tangle of diverse impulses. It isn't, of course, the aim of these lectures to pick at that tangle, perhaps still less to take a sword to it, but rather to follow one thread, as I have to assume from the fact that the late Charles Rosen was invited to initiate the series, and from my presence here this evening, the thread of what we have to call Western classical music, the double epithets testifying to how many musics we now have, and in particular that of contemporary Western classical music. To talk about the place in society as it now exists of Western classical music in general is a task for a higher forum than ours, since this is something that's long been calling out not just for discussion, but for action on the part of governments and certainly of educational authorities. But what I take to be the point of these lectures is a matter not so much of public policy as of analysis. We're concerned with the functions and importance and meaning of the music that's being written now within the classical tradition in society, however we choose to define the latter term. Let's limit ourselves to begin with to the section of society that goes to classical concerts or listens attentively to recordings, broadcasts, or webcasts with any regularity. We're probably not talking about a large group of people here, but we probably are talking about people whose exposure to contemporary work is, in the main, limited. It's a point that's often been made, how in Beethoven's time there was no market for anything earlier than Haydn, anything more than, say, 50 years old, whereas nowadays it's precisely the music of the last half-century, including the work of composers alive today, that's most neglected by the larger musical institutions and least known by the population at large, least present in, to use that old term, society. There's a rampantly healthy hybrid of masochism and snobbery that can make us feel the neglect of contemporary music to be inevitable, even desirable. But I believe we need to extirpate, or at least tame, this unhelpful weed. First, though, I want to consider some of the reasons that have been advanced for why, around a century ago, at the time I was recalling when I began, music started to change more rapidly than ever before in ways at once exciting and disconcerting. And now I'm not saying classical anymore because we know what we're talking about. We can discount the idea that all the possibilities of major-minor tonality, to use that term as a synonym for the kind of musical logic that had obtained throughout the 2.5 centuries from Corelli to Mahler, had been exhausted by the early years of the 20th century. Schoenberg himself once said that he wished he had had longer to work in the style of his first chamber symphony of 1906, a piece whose harmonic logic is often fast and furious and multidirectional, but one whose travels, however sudden and distant, are still all on the continent of E major. As it was, within 2 years he had set sail and was writing his first atonal pieces, after which it took him more than a quarter of a century to feel able to go back to that pre-atonal style and find that indeed there was more to be said within it. However, this reclamation was achieved only, as Schoenberg said, with great difficulty, and, as he did not say, much less freedom than before. For the first chamber symphony is racing to avoid an accident that has not yet happened, whereas Schoenberg's later tonal works are picking up the pieces afterwards and carefully treading around the disaster scene. The first chamber symphony works with the full potential of music in the Viennese tradition at the time, whereas when Schoenberg came to complete his second chamber symphony at the end of the 1930s, he had to set aside the expansions to the tradition that he himself had inaugurated. In doing so, he could hardly discount his own revolution. Indeed, that revolution remains implicit in his late tonal works, in that we seem to be hearing what he is avoiding. And the same is true of anyone else. Once a change has taken place, it cannot be undone. Composers may still decide to write in C major, but this is going to be a different C major from Brahms's, because it's a C major that has to exist in a world where other sorts of scales are options, including no scale at all. Music working with major-minor tonality as if that were the whole universe, because at the time it truly was, such music cannot now be written, except perhaps by a child, since nobody now can be musically educated and yet unaware of developments in music since 1913. The music that still dominates our culture, and that still, for most of us, I would guess, has an immense appeal, the music of that period from Corelli to Mahler, cannot be added to, or could only be added to with an irony quite foreign to it. Once Schoenberg had sensed the air of other planets, to quote the words of Stefan Djorga, he had his soprano soloist singing in his decisive second string quartet. Once Stravinsky and Bartók had found there were other ways to count than in stable meters, the genie was out of the bottle. Just to recap, we can't say that all the potential of old-style composition had been used up by 1913 or any other date, because we have vast quantities of music proving otherwise. What we can say is that once the old language had broken down, once its boundaries had been exceeded, it could only be used with a degree of self-consciousness. Another theory of the origins of musical modernism has it that the developments of 1913 or thereabouts were urged on composers by what had been happening immediately before, that pressure had been building up, as in tectonic plates, so that a rupture was inevitable. This is very persuasive. To return to the example of Schoenberg's First Chamber Symphony, one easily hears in that work a race to escape a collapse of the fundamentals, the collapse that Schoenberg was soon to accept and welcome. Other music of the same period, even from quite different traditions, late Mahler, late Scriabin, late Debussy, seems to be telling us the same story, that the binding power and the driving impetus of standard harmony are on the point of dissolution. Yet though there may well have been some dynamic within the musical material, perhaps operating as an open invitation to explore ever richer chords, ever more distant relationships, ever faster modulations, ever subtler rhythmic inflections, ever new sonorities, ever more complex forms, it seems an insult to the human urge to communicate to insist that composers are merely the pawns of their language. Yes, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, and the rest wanted a century ago to make things new, and composers today, from a couple of whom we'll be hearing directly in the musical performance to come after this lecture, still want to make things new. They may even feel they have no real choice in the matter, that a work of art, in order to be valuable, in order to be authentic, must be made under conditions of full awareness of the available artistic terrain, which will be in perpetual expansion. The language of art, though, is a language of expression. Its means and its dictates are not abstract, but are entrammelled with, are perhaps dependent on, what can and must be expressed. The Rite of Spring is not just a study in pulse and syncopation, it means something. To the composer, the meaning may be opaque at the time. That seems to have been the case here. And artists probably should not bother themselves with meanings anyway, because their job is to make what they alone can make, and what can then be interpreted and reinterpreted endlessly by others. Even so, artists are the hands-on experts, and in the musical domain, some have been articulate precisely about the need for and the meaning of the breaks in musical language that occurred around 1913. Both Schoenberg and Russelot, for example, agreed that tonal harmony had developed to a point where no further development was feasible, though the conclusions they drew and their reasons for drawing them were quite different. Russelot wanted to abandon harmonic considerations altogether in his art of noises, which would be more attuned, if that's quite the word, to the soundscape of contemporary life, to the noises being introduced to the streets by the coming of the automobile, and to the working lives of many people by industrialization. His manifesto articulates another way of understanding musical modernism as more realistic in an age of machines bringing speed, noise, and a new kind of rhythm. Schoenberg, of course, did not want to move beyond harmony, but to extend it. And he, like any romantic, understood his innovations as prompted by desire for emotional truth. Atonality increased the power with which music could convey fear, terror, and dislocation. But it also allowed lines within a musical texture to behave much more independently, and therefore, as Schoenberg saw it, in accord with human feelings, which may often be simultaneously contradictory. I may be, for instance, at once contented, anxious that I should not be feeling contented, annoyed with myself for being anxious, amused at myself for being annoyed, and despairing of myself for being incapable of simple contentment. I think there's something in all these rationales. Music in the last 100 years has been obliged to be different by pressures within the compositional system at whatever time. It has reacted to the roar and the clank with which early 20th century machines made themselves heard. And latterly, we may add, to the impenetrable silence of machines most of us are incapable of understanding. It has striven to come closer to the way we feel and express ourselves in everyday life. It may also have responded to political change, for it's hard to dismiss as mere coincidence the close proximity of 1913 to 1917, or the atmospheres of dismay and almost vain hope in so much music of our own time. None of this, however, quite explains the hard time contemporary music has had and is still having in inserting itself meaningfully into the lives of people beyond the relative few who know the difference between Salvatore Sciarrino and Salvatore Ferragamo. If contemporary music is truer to our sound world, truer to our inner lives, truer to our political uncertainties, why does it not win widespread support? Why do we have the problem this lecture series is implicitly designed to address? I want to try sketching an answer to that question, and it doesn't have much to do with any supposed naturalness in older music that contemporary music either neglects or tries to undo. For one thing, major-minor tonality, to take only that, is a wonderfully but mysteriously effective compound of nature and habit. For another, going against nature isn't always cause for distress. It gives us farming and ballet. But it's true, there was a time in the 1950s and 1960s when composers were exceedingly distrustful of, quite specifically, human nature, and found all kinds of ways to make music that would be controlled by non-human principles, whether algorithms that would determine aspects of sound and form, concepts from math or logic, the direct imitation of non-human sounds, the resonances of bells, for instance, or the songs of birds, or more or less unguided chants. There was a very good reason for such radical innovations, for composers of those times had witnessed, in the Nazi period, what human nature could accomplish. Many people, and by no means only composers, felt that the only way forward for humanity would be to make a fresh start, setting aside as much as possible of the recent past which had delivered such dire consequences. Music that may appear superficially angular, harsh, forbidding, was thus created in a spirit of optimism, which we can still feel once we start realizing that this music was not only about closing doors, but opening them, and that the doors it opened have led into the music that came after, down through the half-century to today. As we know, music since the 1960s has added back much that was barred during that brief zero period of eliminating the past in order to create a new future. And we find even such a radical composer as Helmut Lachenmann writing scores that have a symphonic cogency, that allude to familiar archetypes and even to familiar works, or that reintroduce tonal chords, if not tonal centers. It's often argued, or not really argued, just stated, that music has become more open to past ideals and atmospheres, forms and genres, and therefore more amenable, more caressing, in order to win back an audience that had been lost. But I don't think this is so, or if it is so, the effort hasn't been conspicuously successful. And if we need convincing of that, we only have to look at the season programs of our larger musical institutions. What is perhaps no less characteristic of our time than the low proportion of new music presented in the big concert halls is the low likelihood, I would say the impossibility, that any new music will stimulate anything like the outbursts of 1913 that I was inviting us to remember when I began. You really have to be my age to have experienced, as I did experience in 1970, people walking out noisily from a concert hall or loudly voicing dissent at the end of a performance. In the memory of this city, perhaps the last time a piece of music was greeted with open hostility was almost half a century ago, when Leonard Bernstein presented Cage's Atlas Eclipticalis at the Philharmonic. Since then, there has been peace. And that's not because music has got nicer, but rather because our capacity for outrage has been dulled, and sadly, not only in the musical sphere. Those who once hurled abuse at new music did so not just to express a personal displeasure, but to protest at what they saw or heard as an assault against the boundaries of what could be accepted within their culture. We have no such boundaries because we have no such unitary culture, because we have no such unitary society. Of course, music itself, which tells us everything, mirrors the nature of our complex social organization or disorganization in its own current condition. How, this is a commonplace, there are no norms that are commonly agreed or commonly disputed. I mentioned just now how the music of the 1950s and 1960s opened so many doors. We've had 3 generations of composers rushing through those doors in diverse directions, creating music whose connection to those distant days of Cage and Carter, Boulez and Stockhausen, Nono and Ligeti, may be exceedingly remote, remoter still its connection to anything we can call a larger tradition. The programs of ensembles give us one proof that there survives a notion of new music that embraces those forebears I just named, as well as composers working today. But as time goes on, and as we come to lose our ancestors, the passing of Elliot Carter last year was a reminder of this, the ties stretch thin. It's now more than half a century since Adorno wrote an essay on the aging of the avant-garde. Well, of course, that designation avant-garde has long exceeded its sell-by date. If you have no generally accepted norms, you can't have artists setting up camp outside them. But to the extent that we do still have a concept of new music, how old can that new music become? 50 years? The age, say, of Milton Babbitt's first electronically synthesized compositions created in this city? 60? The age of Pierre Boulez's Le Marteau sans Maître? 90? As Varèse's Hyperprism now is? If we look ahead through this century, how will it be when the defining masterworks of new music are 100 years old? 150? One other question that our fragile new music culture invites us to ask is that of how much new music is destined to continue, or even designed to continue, in the way that the works of Babbitt, Boulez, and Varèse continue to be performed, recorded, and made available on YouTube. We seem to have settled into a world where these composers and a few others have the status of modern classics, but probably only for works they'd composed before the end of the 1960s, works that nearly all composers today would regard as crucial in defining what contemporary music is. We can probably agree on a few classics of the 1970s, such as Steve Reich's Music for 18 musicians, or Gérard Griset's Les Espaces Acoustiques. But if we ask ourselves what are the classics of the 1980s, or the 1990s, or of the first decade of this century, we may have more problems. Works that demand to be heard, demand to be performed, demand to be taken as reference points ought to leap out at us, and they don't. Another symptom of the same musical situation is that evolution in styles has become less detectable if it exists at all. In general life, a lot has changed in the last 30 years, a period that takes us back to the era of Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Margaret Thatcher, to a time when cell phones were bulky machines ostentatiously wielded by a few fast-track bankers, when personal computers were expensive toys, and there was no internet. In music, this last innovation has certainly made a colossal difference to the availability of music, but its effect on composition has been slight. That could alter. After all, sound recording had been going for several decades before Pierre Schaeffer found a creative use for it with his first musique concrète compositions in 1948. And we have glimmerings of at least one possibility for internet music going back to the 1940s, when Varese started imagining a piece that would bring together performers in different parts of the globe. As it stands, though, compositional means and styles have not been much affected by the internet revolution or anything else in the last 3 decades. We could probably all spot quite easily whether a piece we hadn't heard before was written in the 1950s or the 1970s. But we'd almost certainly have a lot more difficulty distinguishing music of the 1980s from music of the 2000s if, again, we didn't know the pieces. Of course, if we're talking about the work of a particular composer, we can probably find some line of development. Composers learn from their achievements. Some of them learn from their mistakes. So we could hear and feel a growth from, say, Kaya Saariaho's Verblendungen of 1982-4 to her Orion of 2002, or from John Adams's Harmonielehrer of 1985 to his Dr. Atomic Symphony of 2007. However, it's not at all as obvious that Verblendungen and Harmonielehrer share trademarks of the 1980s, or that Saariaho's Orion and Adams's Dr. Atomic Symphony are stamped with the sound of the early 21st century. There are no waves that oblige any composer to go in their direction, to take possession of them, or, instead, to resist. Instead, we have lots of smaller currents overlapping and rippling around. What I described before as the tangle of musics in which we live is imitated in little by what I've also mentioned as the tangle of movements and purposes within the sphere of contemporary composition. And though it's impossible here to talk of cause and effect, these two things are surely linked phenomena, the multifarious state of the art and the lack of those classics, those irremovable landmarks that oblige composers to take note of them, that require composers to situate themselves in the landscape those classics define, and then, of course, to change the landscape. As it is, the scene has stayed pretty much unaltered for 3 decades, maybe more, with the great totems of new music hanging around and no new ones being added. Composers have had to resign themselves to a throwaway culture, a culture that still has a keen appetite for the new, but not much interest in what happened yesterday or the day before. Everything that's meant by the term classical, that important works go on being valued while being constantly redefined by performance and interpretation, is confounded. One further aspect of new music today may be relevant here. There are just so many composers. 40 years ago, an interested listener could gain a fairly thorough acquaintance with contemporary music quite quickly. The watershed moment of 1945 was only 3 decades in the past, not 7. Maybe no more than 20 composers were regarded as leading the field. There was no internet, of course, and only very selective representation of new music on record. 3 or 4 albums gave you all you could get of Elliott Carter. There was a release on a rare French label that was the only available recording of music by Steve Reich. And because the records were so few, we all heard them. including those from among my generation who emerged as composers. Contrast that with the situation today, when contemporary music has become, if I might so put it, the victim of its own success. The excitement of what I referred to before as an opening of doors, that excitement has stimulated multitudes of young composers, and it goes on doing so. It's hard to bemoan this, but the population increase does have its problems. With the internet now giving access to thousands of creative talents, a listener may easily become astonished, bewildered, frustrated, and ultimately bored. And because the new music landscape isn't changing very much, composers may go on responding in rather similar ways. For composition, we should remember, is not creation ex nihilo, but comes as dialogue between the individual imagination and the environment. Here's one other circumstance that may be cause for concern, that the environment for composers today is becoming narrowed to the new music environment, the landscape marked out by a few venerable classics and the familiar organizational world of teachers and ensembles. There are very good reasons why new music has, in recent decades, increasingly separated itself from the larger, let's reintroduce that old word again, society. Those reasons including society's growing indifference. And I'm not just talking here about the withdrawal of composition and performance to the universities, but about a lack of connection between new music and other aspects of the world. Someone pointed out decades ago that the only periodical to be published in this country throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s without mentioning the Vietnam War was Perspectives of New Music. At the time, that was a criticism aimed at what was perceived as a particularly isolated, ivory towery school of composition that purposely removed itself from the hurly-burly in which other composers had to live. I'm speaking, of course, in terms of caricature. But now, musical isolationism goes unremarked because it's everywhere. I'm not just pointing out here a lack of politically engaged music. We don't have that, I believe, or we don't have very much of it, because we can't have any conviction nowadays that our voices, even our musical voices, will be heard. Our mute helplessness as citizens of what we go on calling democracies is one symptom of the decay I've already mentioned in any meaningful notion of society. But the limitation of composition to a purely musical environment, and even a purely new musical environment, is a larger phenomenon, and I would say a larger danger. One sign of our times is the proliferation of new musical ensembles, including several here in New York that have got going in the last decade or so, Talea, ICE, Alarm Will Sound, Axiom, many more. Now, it would be absurd to lament this development any more than to lament the number of composers we have, especially if we remember the time 20 years ago when lively new music concerts were much thinner on the ground. And certainly one can see the practical need for these groups. On the one hand, many of the classics of the 1950s and 1960s are for just such formations of up to a dozen or so virtuoso soloists. On the other, this whole repertory is almost totally ignored by symphony orchestras and other large institutions, with occasional and remarkable exceptions, such as some of the concerts James Levine used to give with the Met Orchestra. If ICE and Axiom aren't playing the music of Olga Neuwirth, who is? So our situation is entirely understandable, even if it does mean that new music is generally being performed by small ensembles for relatively small audiences in relatively small venues away from a city's musical hub. At Miller Theatre rather than Lincoln Center, not at Carnegie Hall, but tucked away downstairs. Contemporary music has become a niche market, or rather a whole unruly bazaar of niche markets, smaller and smaller, inviting composers to cater for the specifics of those markets, the performers, the spaces, the traditions, and all at some distance from the centers and concerns of anything resembling larger society. Where new music was integral to society 100 years ago, as our disruptions of 1913 tell us, and still integral to musical society 50 years ago, around the time of the Cage performance at the Philharmonic, now it's hardly integral to itself, but instead something like a Saturday shopping mall, crowded with people listening to their headsets, all in their own worlds, in a general silence. The ultimate end of this disintegration would have to be a world of innumerable composers, all doing their own things and setting out their stores on the internet for whomever would come by. Lots of music, lots of different kinds of music, and no society. Maybe this is where we're headed, but I hope not, and I don't believe so. But before I move on to what I see as optimistic and promising in the state of music today, and in the potential it holds for occupying a much fuller place in what may hopefully become a much fuller society, I want to say just one more thing about the Tower of Babel, a tower very definitely not made of ivory, in which we currently find ourselves. And I want to do so by way of suggesting an answer to the question that's been dangling almost since the beginning of this talk, namely, why did music change so rapidly around a century ago, and then again in the middle of the 20th century? Certainly, we can identify internal pressures and contradictions that made the generally accepted musical language ripe for bursting. And certainly, because music is not, or was not then, a world all its own, we can find parallels and prompts for change in new theories of human emotions, which we might flag as Freudian, or changed notions of universal time and space, with Einstein as their presiding genius, or a new sense of human equality, for which I wish we could find a pleasanter poster child than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. All these things, however, impinge on music only by way of metaphor. Music does not directly represent emotions or gravitational waves or structures of political power and authority. What music does represent, in ways no other art form or mode of experience can come near communicating, is the flow of time. And I would argue that the representation of this flow in tonal music, music of that great period from Corelli, where tonality is new and exact, to Mahler, where it's old and disintegrating, is enormously persuasive. But this music tells us that the passing of time is orderly, that progression will unfold, only strengthened by opposition, that there is a goal to any span of time, and that this goal will be reached. We're dealing here with the period opened by Corelli's contemporary Descartes, the period when religious authority in the West was supplanted by rationalism. Music during that period offered an alternative assurance of meaning, an embodiment of time as moving always in the direction of clarity and amelioration. Things were getting better all the time. And if one could see the musical composition, the symphony, say, as an image of the human life, then here was firm assurance of coherence, of wholeness in the passage, to quote the title of a Liszt symphonic poem, from the cradle to the grave. Very different is the impression of time we gain from the music of the last 100 years. Not more or less steady progress, but switchback rides, recycling instants running on the spot, dartings here and there, total stasis, counterpoints of diverse temporal streams, music speaking with, from, and in innumerable, incompatible directions. The condition of our musical world as a whole, one of enormous confusion, is likely to be that on a smaller scale of any individual composition. We're not going to find, whether surfing YouTube or listening to a musical work of size and substance, any single guiding line. Through these labyrinths, there are no threads. And I would suggest that all of us find this disturbing as well as exhilarating. We crave the reassurances that tonal music gave us. Without them, we feel ourselves lost. It's time to test out some optimism. I suggested earlier that music since the 1980s has been relatively stationary, perhaps more stationary than at any time since the mid-18th century, as well as unusually various, certainly more various than at any earlier time at all. So it may be, but I think we may be able to detect one area of slight movement, one theme common to a lot of the music of our time, which is a recovery, of modality. I'm not speaking of the fully fledged imitation of old-fashioned tonality, whether of its resources or merely of its effects, that's provided much of the new orchestral repertory of the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean something more subtle and far less predictable, something more tentative and ambiguous, something where the authority of one note or one chord or one scale may be no more than a momentary flickering to the surface or a dim light in the darkness, something we may feel to be in process of arrival. We lost, a century ago, music that seemed to support our sense of time as progressive from beginning to end, time following the span of the human life, time as we probably wish it still were or could be again. We gained time as clamour, time as fog, time unyielding to our wishes and insensitive to the dimensions of our lives. Now, in what I take to be a transitional phase in the long story of our species, we may be hearing, coming to us in our music, a new time, one that does not deny complexity, but does not deny either the tempo of the heartbeat and the walking step, one that takes its measure not from the individual life, but perhaps from some larger life we all, for our brief moment, share. Thank you very much.
Good. Hello? Can you hear us? Yes. Great.
Right. Oh, no, I haven't switched on. Okay.
Thank you, Paul, for this eloquent speech. And I'd like to also thank the performers for those beautiful
Yes, indeed.
Very, very much. Do you mind if I tell a very quick story?
Sure.
I'm Jeff Milarsky.
I've spoken enough.
I'm Jeff Milarsky, by the way. So I've been thinking a lot about what Paul just spoke about for a very long period of time, many, many years. And I decided to do what I called a grand experiment. Before I actually heard this speech tonight, I have a 3.5-year-old daughter who I'm very, very proud of. And she hears me preparing music that might not be standard fare, would you say. A lot of my life is very complex composers, very modern compositions, and also some very old music as well. So we were doing a children's concert in Philadelphia. A friend of mine asked me to come with some Columbia Orchestra musicians to a public school in Philadelphia to do a children's concert. And I said, sure, I'll do some things. I brought a few people. We did two very famous works. One you might know of, one many of you may not know. I know Paul knows both of these works. And I told him we were going to do the first work, and he was very excited, of course. And I didn't reveal to him what to my excitement, I was doing a piece by Morton Feldman in Philadelphia the previous week called Rothko Chapel, which I'm not sure if everybody knows this work, but it's magical for all the right reasons for chorus, wordless chorus, viola, percussion, and celesta. Very small ensemble. I'll get into the specifics of the piece in a moment. So we began with Prokofiev, Peter and the Wolf, a very small version, and of course this is the go-to piece for children, and they were 5 and 6-year-olds, and they were very, very noisy, and we started playing. And by the way, I also consider Peter and the Wolf a masterpiece of incredible, as we all know, and it's sophisticated on levels that, of course, we all know, not just the obvious melodic things, but harmonically, and it's spectacular for all the right reasons, structurally as well. So we started with Peter and the Wolf, and I could sense, I'm a conductor, I'm in the business of sensing what's happening behind me, meaning the audience generally. And I could sense that they were animated and not in a good way, the children. They loved the music, they all knew the music, it seemed, but they weren't really paying attention. I've been very sensitive to this. I have a 3.5-year-old, and I could really, you know what about children, you know when they start paying attention to you, and it can be very, very small, a very small thing, and all of a sudden they listen. It's a beautiful thing when it happens. So we did the Prokofiev, they loved it, they were crazy, they were never really, I didn't think, very, very involved. We did it, it was fantastic. We began, and it was just a few moments of Peter and the Wolf. Then I decided, of course this was insane to do Rothko Chapel, which is one of my all-time favorite pieces. And we began with this, and it's a wordless chorus, and it's just sound in space. Structurally, very, very, very sound, of course, but sound in space. And also silence is a huge part of this piece. Where silence begins, where sound ends, it's blurred. It's a very sophisticated idea. And what I noticed, and this is incredible, I noticed absolute silence behind me. And to the point that it was a little eerie. There was total focus in the room. And it made what's left of my hair stand up straight, to the point that I've rarely been so moved by the energy coming from behind me. And afterwards, there was an amazing amount of applause. I didn't expect the audience to understand intellectually what went on, but I asked for questions. And I said, what did you like about the pieces that you heard to these young children? And one child stood up and said, I'll never forget this. I can't believe it because it moved me so much. He said, I love the red and the blue. And I thought to myself, how insightful, because what we're doing is creating these textures and canvases and landscapes and colors, and musicians are dealing with this all the time. If you notice in both the pieces, they're dealing with the very, very edges of sound, right where sound stops, and you don't even want to hear it stop. And I was so moved by this.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, as you were talking about all of these things, is it possible we're just not starting? Maybe we need to start from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just the younger generation. I mean, by young, I'm talking about people that have no idea what it's like to make music, to compose music, to make music, to even understand about sound, except for some guttural instinct.
I think you're right. I had the same experience with my own children. And just one experience of teaching a class of 10, 11-year-olds, the reaction to, I remember specifically, the Vorez Poème Électronique, just absolutely fascinating. I was just going to play a couple of minutes. They wanted to hear the whole thing. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. But we're talking in a culture where no music is offered very much in schools anymore. But yeah, myself, I played the piano as a small boy, but I didn't obviously play anything like this in terms of the repertoire or the standard of performance. But it wasn't until I was in my teens that I really started to get into music beyond what was piano music, well, beyond Manfred Gerlit and all the rest of it. And I learnt Babbitt and Boulez at the same time as Tchaikovsky's symphonies. And I think it really, really does help if you can get in there at an early age.
It's interesting you're saying this too, because I teach at Juilliard as well, and I have to say, in the past, something has happened very, very important in the past 10 years too, because I have young students that are 17 and 18 years old that are playing Beethoven, and I've always preached this, I don't know why it's all of a sudden it's happening now, but they're playing with the same care, Beethoven and Brahms and Tchaikovsky and Mahler, the same care and the same sound, cultivation that they're playing Schoenberg, Babbitt, Lindbergh, Saunders, Hans Abrahamson, and it's sort of overwhelming as a teacher, because I actually think that we're on the road to something different, because not only are listeners being cultivated on this end, but also the performers, they seem to have no limitations at all. I know you feel this too. Young people playing Elliott Carter is a remarkable experience, and I also wonder. This is a very, very, I don't say this in public very often, but I wonder whether early performances of works were ever really performed very well. And I don't include a few of them, but early Schoenberg performances, what did they sound like?
Well, they were okay. From what we know, I mean, there's a recording of Pierre Lunaire that he made here in the States.
It's not very fluid.
Yeah. But then, I mean, it was a different period. I mean, we play music differently, not only in terms of the standard, but in terms of what we bring to it from our own time. And if you listen to I think there are now 4 recordings that Pierre Boulez has made of Le Matin sans Maître, and the tempos are vastly different.
And also the later ones have a sense of, his latest recording, for instance, has a sense of I use the word very in quotes, a hipness, a swing of the rhythms, a swing of things, whereas before it was very rigid, and they're playing exactly the same notes. But his sense of it, and I think performer's sense of it, is this long paragraphs, phrases, sentences, whereas before it was how can we play the damn piece together?
Yeah.
How can we even play the right notes with the right rhythms? And
Yes, but I don't think it's only a practical matter. I do think that there's an ethos, there's a way of listening to music, performing music, understanding music now, which is different from, we're talking about Marta Semenet's piece, 60 years old, from a very different world, a world of modern jazz and everything else that was feeding into that. It's so totally different now.
my experience with young musicians today are kind of incredible as well. Just a quick story, another quick one. At Juilliard, I was preparing for a piece by Charles Wernin, who many of you know, one of our great New York institutions, a piece called Cyclops, a very difficult piece, written for the London Sinfonietta, and our friend Oliver Nussin, one of my heroes. And the first rehearsal, I had set aside 10 rehearsals for this work, because I knew this was going to be a very, very complex situation. It's a very difficult piece. And I came to the first rehearsal and was flabbergasted that at the first rehearsal, everything was, I don't want to say was all ready to go, but it was, we start at such a high level now. Mm-hmm. And I think the oldest person in the room was 20 years old. And wow. This is a very, very complicated work. And Charles's comment to me at the end, when we finally performed the thing, I had to cancel, by the way, 3 rehearsals, because we didn't need all that time. But at the end, when he heard the performance, he said, the thing that I notice is the ease at which they're playing, but they're also getting the through line of a 30-minute work from beginning to end. And I think this is so, I want to just say that I think that we're ready for some change. I think that if we can perform pieces like this and influence young composers and influence even composers that are 80, 90, and 100 years old, I think we are in the midst of great change. Mm-hmm. I'm very confident with this.
I hope so.
But I appreciate everything you say, because it's been as someone who conducts and tries to put forth these ideas. Sometimes it's very difficult to convince people of purity, in a sense, of these values that we hold so high.
It's difficult to convince people that this music actually matters, that it means something to our lives, and that it can change our lives and influence the way we think about everything else in our lives.
And on the same note, I mean, I've conducted music where people that don't even understand what we just did are wild about what we just did. And I think there's something in that where you don't even have to be esoterically involved with this work, but you just something attracts you.
Yeah, well, I mean that's how it is for all of us, for heaven's sake. I mean, before you can start to study a piece or think about it intellectually, it's got to make some impact on you. Otherwise, why would you begin to think about it?
Of course. So before we open up the floor for some questions, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. And one in particular is, the first time I met you, I met you first through, of course, your book, which I have read many, many, many times, many of your publications, and was always so excited to meet you. When I found out I was going to be conducting Elliott Carter's opera, What Next, the New York premiere at Miller Theater. And I was very excited to meet you, and I thought maybe you could share, since Elliott Carter lived very close by, and we miss him very much, I thought maybe you could just describe just a few moments of how What Next happened. How did it come to be? How did you get hooked up with Elliott and write this amazing libretto that you wrote for this, I think, one of the classics of modern opera, What Next?
Well, thank you. He asked me, and I wasn't going to say no. He asked me in a very sudden way, otherwise maybe I might have said no. But we had both been at a presentation that another colleague of mine, Francis Marie Wheaty, was giving here at the Italian Institute. She was talking about Chelsea and demonstrating some of Chelsea's use of the cello, of course, being her instrument, and I'd been there with Elliott. This was an early evening, a sort of 6:30-ish thing, and then I had to get all the way up to Lincoln Center for an 8 o'clock concert, and Elliott just grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "I want to write an opera, come and see me." And I said, yeah, sure, and I had to get out and get a taxi to go uptown. But I did then make contact with him through Boozy. And we met, and he discussed a couple of possibilities. One was the birds of Aristophanes. Another was the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Emperor's New Clothes. And the third thing was the idea of a traffic accident. And that seemed to be what most excited him. And what he was looking for, why he thought of the traffic accident would be a good idea, was why old-fashioned composers often used to ask this question: why are they singing? Why aren't they speaking to me? And the answer for what next was they're singing because they've had this impact on them, and they don't know where they are, and they're lifted out of their ordinary worlds by the car crash, which doesn't apparently have any serious effect on them, but it psychologically, it jolts them, and they start to sing. So that was why it developed that way. And I've had this experience with composers several times. Composers know they know what they don't want, and of course you have to write the words first, and then the music will come after. So you're constantly writing little bits of text, and the composer, no. And Eliot would say, no, it's too expressionist. There were several things he kept saying. One was, I want to have fun. It was clear this was going to be a comedy, which is not too common in our time, sadly. It's a great pity, actually, that there's not more. I mean, such a lot of our music, I often think it's a great pity looking around concert hall, people look so serious. A lot of our music is very funny, and you should be listening to a Mozart piano concerto and laughing out loud at times. Well, maybe it's not a very good idea, but you should be smiling anyway. A lot of our music is very funny, and it's a pity that, I mean, there are pieces by Carter, there are pieces by Babbitt that are funny, but it's a big pity that comedy isn't more present in our music. Anyway, he wanted to write a comedy. He said, I want to have fun, and so if I started to get too serious or too dark, no, that was not the way. It's like, oops, sorry. Maybe I should put this a bit further down. You open a door, and that's not the right door, and then eventually you find the right door. And then once I'd done that, then it was plain sailing. It's like with most writing. I know about writing because that's what I do, but probably most people feel this in anything that they do, that the first 10% of the task takes 90% of the time. Once you've got into it, then you're away. And apart from saying, I want to have fun, the other thing that Eliot was saying was, if you don't get this libretto ready, I'm going to write a flute concerto. Which he did. He did then, in time for his 100th birthday, he wrote a flute concerto that was commissioned for Israel, I think. But at the time, he was just coming towards the end of finishing up his quintet for piano and strings, and this is early 97, so he was a mere 88 at the time, but even at the age of 88, he didn't want to hang around, he didn't want to be waiting with nothing to do. This was a composer who wrote every day, as far as I'm aware, and so he wanted to go straight on from the quintet for piano and strings to the opera. Otherwise, it was going to be the flute concerto, and that would be another 6 months or something.
Did he write the music as you delivered the text? How did it work? No,
I don't believe so. He wanted the whole thing there. He wanted to see the shape of the whole thing. And then when I was going to see him. I was taking it in dribs and drabs. I was going sometimes twice a week to take him whatever I'd done over not a very long period. And then we got to the end, and he took it away. They had a summer place outside the city, and he came back and said, we need another couple of minutes here. So I wrote another little scene, and then it didn't get, maybe he lost it, I don't know, but it didn't get into the final piece. What he set was what we'd come up with in February, March of 97. And it's a funny thing writing the libretto. I mean, I became aware of it at that time. The only person who ever looks at the libretto completely apart from the music is the person who's writing the libretto. Otherwise, it's part of you read the libretto before you're going to a performance, or you read it during the performance with titles, or you read it while you're listening to a recording. But the person who actually writes these words has no idea. Well, of course, with Eliot, I knew what he'd written before, but he hadn't written an opera before, and the vocal music that he'd written before was Elizabeth Bishop, and so it was not music, not operatic. It wasn't obviously close to opera, so I really had no idea how this was going to sound.
But the music is so fully integrated with your words, and it's in a reverse way. Your words are very integrated with the music, so it's not just his doing as well. There was some symbiotic.
Well, I knew who I was trying to write for, and what might stimulate him, and so on.
So as I was preparing that score, I prepared a list of about 100 questions. I was told this is the time that Eliot can see me. I went down to his apartment. It's a very busy score at times, other times very, very pure and plain in ways, and in beautiful ways. And I had my list of questions, and he began taking me through every page of this music with musical suggestions and dramatic suggestions related to your text, and structural ideas that he was thinking about, così fan tutte, and different quartets, quintets, as you wrote about in the liner notes as well, your working notes. But it was remarkable, and I just threw my questions on the floor because he had spent 45 minutes of answering everything that I could possibly know. Within his level of energy was unbelievable, and
yes.
Unrivaled, I think, not just age-wise, but just energy-wise. Is remarkable.
Oh yeah, and his memory for for certainly his own, we all know, extremely detailed scores. One experience I had when he was well into his 90s. What's the title of that song cycle that has Quasimodo and people, Italian song? Tempo
Tempo e Tempi.
Tempo e Tempi. I was writing a program note on this piece, and there was one little thing that I didn't quite understand, or some tiny question about one measure in one song of this piece, and I rang him up and explained what I was doing, and he took no time at all to say, well, that's this, with no preparation.
Yeah. And he also revealed to me a different side, which I was unprepared for. It was, when you think about, if you're a young musician, and you see a score of Elliott Carter's, it's very detailed, it's very rigid, it's very structured, and you feel that you potentially don't have a lot of room for your own self-expression. And I remember this one phrase at the beginning where Rose is about to sing her melismatic aria, or just notes, actually, just shaking notes. And he said to me, in one of the rehearsals, why are you not taking time? Why are you not giving space? And there was nothing in the score that indicated anything like that at all, of course. But it told me the true essence of this musician. Actually, of course it needed space. Of course it needed to hover for a moment from one mood to another. This wasn't one of those moments of tension, mood to mood. This was a transitional moment, and it had to be a dramatic moment. It had to be almost Mozartian in the way that you needed to take your time and move your mood from place to place. And it was just remarkable, the insight, and also the tradition that he brought to his compositions. We always think about breaking tradition, but we often don't think about keeping certain elements of tradition.
Yeah. Certainly the discipline that he got at the knee of Nadia Boulanger, we think of that as coming to an end in the late 40s, but no, it goes right on.
Of course. I'd like to invite some questions at this time. Is there any questions we have for Paul, or any of the music you heard, or anything at all? We have microphones set up on either side. There must be something. Yes. Hi.
Can you say why you chose, I assume you chose the music, that was
I
performed.
chose the
Why
music.
you chose it and why the repeat of the Saunders.
Well, Anthony said we want sort of 10 minutes or so of music. Well, a lot of pieces last more than 10 minutes, and a lot of pieces use more instruments. I was told sort of 4 or 5 instruments, 10 minutes of music. So I thought it'd be nice to, if we were going to have short pieces, let them really be quite short, and let's have a little pattern in there so that it feels like a program. And often I think too it's something quite unfamiliar, even if it only lasts 2 minutes or so, like this little piece of Rebecca Saunders. It's good to hear it twice. So that was that. These are 2 composers. Both of them somewhat, well, Hans is kind of my generation, Rebecca Saunders is kind of the next generation down, but 2 composers who I think are it's not that I don't think there are another 200 who are outstanding too, but 2 composers that I would be very happy for people to hear.
I think it's brilliant too because I often feel that way, even with I actually feel that way with longer works. I love as much for the audience as for the performers, just to live through it again, to give it a better reading, better or worse or different or different. I mean, it has a life all its own. And I've often thought about what would it be like to do Beethoven, Fifth Symphony on the first half and Beethoven Fifth Symphony on the second half. Same. It will be forever different, and forever you will hear and listen and process differently, and the moods will be changeable, malleable and changeable, and it's.
That is,
So I think it's an incredible thing, not just about length of pieces as well. Are you doing anything with Hans Abrahamsson now?
Yes, thank you for the leading question. The little book that was mentioned, let me tell you, the Ophelia book. Hans wrote a piece called Schnee about 5 years ago. Which came out on I strongly recommend this piece to you. Came out on a record, and I heard this. And I hadn't been in touch with him for a very long time, and I wrote him a sort of fan letter, and he responded very warmly, and we'd known each other a long time ago. And then I sent him this book, and he responded warmly to that too, and decided, there are other people involved in this plot, including one who is in this room, and a certain soprano called Barbara Hannigan. Well, Annie, my wife, got together with Barbara Hannigan and Hans, and somehow it all happened, and this piece is happening now in Berlin in December, commissioned from the Berlin Philharmonic for soprano and orchestra, setting songs from this strange novel of mine. So yes, so I will have a stronger connection with this music in a little while.
I definitely think he's an incredible, impeccable composer, and he's probably not very well known here in America, but I was lucky enough to conduct a piece of his that he arranged Schoenberg's little piano pieces.
Opus 19 pieces, yeah.
Or ensemble.
Yes.
It is meticulous. It's almost, it's not just a modern view of it, but it's illuminating,
Yes.
hearing the melodies weave between the instruments and Klangfarben melody, and it's incredible. So please listen to Hans Abrahamsson. He's a very, very special musician.
Yes, and an unusual career that he had a lot of success in his late 20s and 30s. And then for about 10 years, he did little arrangements, these Schoenberg pieces and Nielsen pieces and Bach canons he did instrumentations of. A wonderful sense of instruments and combinations, but not writing anything new of his own at all for about 12 years, and then piano concerto at the beginning of this century, and Schnee is 2006, and on it goes. So a kind of pause. And maybe he didn't know he would compose again, I don't know, but the long, long pause, and then something new.
Do you have any advice for a young composer today? Say a young composer came to you and they were searching for their own voice or something. you have any advice for them?
Any advice would have to be over. I mean, I wouldn't come right out. I mean, you'd have to get to know the person. I appreciate the question, but the situation is so precarious at the moment in all kinds of ways, and I don't know how people do manage to listen to their music and find their music in the world we live in, because it is just musically so confusing that 50 years ago you could say, well, I'm a follower of Stockhausen, or I hate Stockhausen, or whatever. But there aren't these big, oh, you've got to go this way, or no, you've got to fight against that. We don't have, as I was saying, we don't have these huge, colossal figures anymore. They are disappearing from us. We've talked about Pierre Boulez, George Courtag. It's very sad that we are moving into a world where our living links to this crucial post-war period are disappearing.
Yes, please. Hello.
Mr. Griffiths, I'm glad your lecture ended on a positive note, but it was a brief note, and I wonder if you could expand a bit, perhaps qualify or quantify where you saw this landing area that we had arrived in, not tonally, you said, but modally, or a sense of reality that we'd.
Well, obviously, the notes don't fall as they please in these two pieces we heard. We heard a lot of modal and even tonal things coming back, but I find that in a lot of music today, without going back to the big symphonic oomph from beginning to end, which I think did come to an end 100 years ago, but something where the sense of time, where time has some meaning, but I don't know, it's linked to a sense that we are something beyond ourselves. I mean, I think Cage said something. Somebody said to Cage in one of these conversation books, "Well, will we go on listening to Beethoven?" And Cage said, "Yeah, we'll go on listening to Beethoven, but we won't take him seriously." Now, that was a kind of flip comment, but I think there is something in the great tradition which we all value, that there's something that is out of joint, that we feel is not responding to our experience of our lives. This sense that there is one direction and you get to the goal at the end. I don't feel that to be so right, doesn't feel so right. And I feel we had a lot of music which said, okay, we won't have goals at all. We'll go any which way and we'll have total stasis. Wonderfully done in the Morton Feldman that you mentioned, but we won't have this drive. Well, now I think we're getting just a subtler kind of drive, a kind of drive that you feel it and it's gone. That seems to me to, and it would be a whole other lecture to do this, that seems to me to be more in tune with how we feel about our lives, and that we are less lone individuals on our course from birth to death, and that is the main thing, that we are part of something much larger. And I feel this new modality, and I can't analyze this, and maybe it would take me a decade to think it through, but that there is something more general and more ambiguous in our lives, and more ambiguous in our understanding of tonality, and that our that I've voiced this kind of criticism of the great tradition, but of course we have been misunderstanding that music in many ways, in imagining, you were just talking about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is not one thing. And when it was written, it wasn't one thing. It was published in versions for piano duet and all the rest of it. That there is no such thing as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It's lots of things which, of course, are related. They all have roughly the same notes in roughly the same places, but it's a whole network of things stretching out to things which are not it, and to things which are very centrally it. So I think our understanding of traditional music is changing as well.
This is a little difficult to articulate, but I'd like both of you to respond to something that's been bothering me for a long time, both as a composer and a listener. When I hear something like, for example, the end of the cadenza of the violin concerto by Brahms at the first movement, and it gets so quiet, and there's such a gorgeous dolce when it's presented properly. And every note has a certain meaning that has to be played a certain way, and you can feel it as the violinist goes from the D to the F sharp. It just has to be a certain beautifully right way, or it isn't right. And these appoggiaturas that come in are so expressive, and you feel the goosebumps. Now, as much as I love the sounds of our 20th century, late 20th century and early 21st century music, I very rarely feel an experience like that. Some of the music of Magnus Lindberg was presented by the Philharmonic, and he's a marvelous composer with wonderful resources. But I didn't get that kind of message from those pieces. I sort of did from the Charles Ives Fourth recently, but is it me? Am I missing something? Are you getting those messages from music, or is there something different going on that or do you really feel that, or maybe is that why nobody's a dominant composer anymore? I mean, how do you deal with that aspect of it?
Well, you're talking about a movement, a harmonic movement within a progression that has an emotional, that you feel involved with. And that's exactly what I was talking about with traditional tonal music, we feel this close involvement from moment to moment, which a lot of music that's written in the last 100 years is not trying to do. It's trying to avoid that, or it's trying to find some other way of handling time. But if it's not trying, if it is still giving us some kind of through line or some kind of wavy through line, I think one can still find those moments when I find them when the piano in that Rebecca Saunders starts playing a little tune, or when some instrument comes in, or when the rhythmic flow suddenly changes. So I think we don't have to deny ourselves those moments. They exist.
I find it all the time. I have to say, you need to listen to really great Magnus Lindberg, not his latest scores. You need to listen to his scores from the 70s and 80s, and pieces like Ur and pieces like Joy. Oh boy, my gosh. I get the same chills thinking about this massive work called Joy, where he is working on harmonic sequences, and there are waves of sound that overlap and make that same feeling that you're describing here. And by the way, you're talking about a very modern, I want to interpret it, I think, as a modern sentiment of the sound is affecting you, not necessarily structurally, but structurally in the sense that it feels right. This is the right moment in that composition for this to blossom. That I know exactly what you're talking about. I feel exactly the same way at that point coming out, where the transition back to the orchestral, where the orchestra comes back in. It's hair-raising. But I find this in many, many, many works. And it's not just the works that are always performed. I think you have to search for them. You're also talking about one of the most glorious moments in all of the symphonic repertoire, too. I mean, it's, I want to say that's not in every work. It's not in every early work of Beethoven. It's not in every early work of Haydn, or some late works of Haydn, I should dare say that. But that's a very, very special, special moment. Modern music or otherwise, that stands out to me as one of the greatest moments. So, moments in the Matthew Passion, same thing. Moments in Joy, moments in Requiem Canticles of Stravinsky make me just... sometimes I don't even know, before I even opened the score of this piece, I didn't know anything about it. I had this same vision that you had, this same reaction. Like, music, this is some of the most heavenly music ever written. And such an odd piece of music, too. So maybe it's perception, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't be here conducting and...
It doesn't answer your question.
And thinking about it and writing about this music if we didn't have these moments. I mean, I can remember as a student being just bowled over by hearing Plis l'Empli of Boulez on the radio.
Magic.
And pieces that Birtwistle was writing, and verses for ensembles, and then going to hear these pieces and the goosebumps, yeah.
Towards the end, you were mentioning music written with rhythm from the steps and the heartbeat. Yeah. I was thinking about rhythms of inhaling and exhaling.
Yeah.
Like the beginning to Sibelius's Tapiola, that's certainly inhaling and exhaling.
Yeah.
The third movement of Mahler's fourth, before the singing final, that's totally breathing.
Yes.
So maybe the society that you're looking for today won't happen because we're choked. There's no clean air to breathe anymore. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I don't live most of the time in New York, so I have a different perspective, but on clean air. But what I said about rhythm was it was meant as fact, but also much more as metaphor. That music is I feel in the immediate post-war period tried to avoid anything where the authority came from human nature, anything that sounded nice or that gave an impression of regular rhythm that you could respond to, or a harmonic progression that worked because of the way our ears worked. That was suspect for very, very good reasons, that people were terrified of what unbridled human nature had brought about. And they would... And this, we all bemoan modern architecture. Well, modern architecture came about in order to have something very precise and mathematically secure that didn't take its measure from human life and human experience, but was abstract and with new materials. And this is the way composers were feeling at that time for excellent humanist reasons. Well, maybe we have got to trust ourselves a little bit more now, and to believe that if our music and our arts in general respond more to the measures of the human body and the human mind, that we are not going to court disaster in that way, but maybe find some kind of new sensibility.
Elliot Carter said something once. Elliot Carter said something about listening, and this always struck me about, I think you had asked him, or someone had asked him, how do you listen to music? And he said something he had two words that always stuck with me. He said, pay attention.
Yes.
Because Because it's not just about letting music just sort of wave over you, but I find myself listening so much more if I'm trying to get into the architecture, if I'm trying to get into what the performers are doing, therefore I can get what the composer is doing. Let me be sort of part of their flight, if you will.
Well, for Eliot, this was not just a matter of music. He was very fearful and bothered by people not paying attention, because then they're prey to forces that are out of their control. If you pay attention to what a TV program or an advert is trying to promote, if you look behind the message, where's this coming from? What is this trying to persuade me of? Who's benefiting here? Then you're an alert member of society, and he wanted people to be alert and critical and thinking about their lives. And music, he was a composer, so he wanted to present music which offered a lot to attend to and offered a lot of pleasures from paying attention. That the more you pay attention to this music, the more you will gain from it, the more you will understand why some things are happening, and the more pleasure, the more simple pleasure you will get from it.
I like your image of breathing, though, because isn't another type of breathing? If you just go with me on this for a moment, Xenakis. It's an evil word in some circles, right? It's a very difficult name to spell, and it's got an X in it, and it's dark, right? But for instance, Xenakis textures so dense, so much counterpoint that they're not counterpoint. I use that word very loosely, where it's just thickness of texture, just block-like sound, and then stasis. Isn't that another type of breathing from the composer? It may be a different one that you're describing, but it's cause and effect and inhalation, exhalation, possibly.
Well, also, there's a wonderful thing that Milan Kundera wrote about Xenakis, saying that when he was in Czechoslovakia in the 50s and 60s, and so much being bombarded with fabricated messages, that listening to the radio and hearing Xenakis, which wasn't trying to persuade him of anything, which was just completely strange and coming from some other planet, this was a consolation. Something that we might think to be anti-human was in fact a consolation because it was coming from a human being and it wasn't trying to drive home some line.
Well, I heard the Strasbourg Percussion Ensemble perform his...
Terza Fassa?
Yeah, and the reviewer the next day in the paper thought it was like fun and happy. To me, it sounded like being in a place where there was an air raid. Bombs were falling all over the place.
Precisely.
Yeah, I think that's where he was going with that.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly it. Swirling.
Philosophically, at the start of the metastasis, there's that clap, right? So I was always wondering, and in a lot of modern music, there's a clap like that, a simple clap, wood slap or whatever. What's the philosophy behind that? Is that the door closing, the door opening?
Let's hope it's opening.
Huh?
I said, let's hope it's opening.
Yes.
The beginning of Jagden und Formen of Riem starts with the entire ensemble actually doing this. And it's not just a gimmick, it's an incredible moment for the audience to come in dramatically, as if you're seeing the opening of Otello, right into the ocean, right into the sea, into the raging sea. Boom, the game starts. Just a sort of modern view of how does music begin, you know? It doesn't ease us in, it's immediate. To shock you in a way, or to sort of smack you in the way, just here we are. Come with us.
The way Haydn does.
Haydn does it all the time, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a problem.
It's just one example.
How do you start? How do you get into this world? A minute in, you know where you are, but at the beginning you don't. So how are you going to get to this point where you know where you are? You've got to start somewhere.
I've just been given a signal that we are absolutely out of time. I'd like to thank Paul.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This is terrific. Executive office.
Not at all. That's just fascinating. It's just interesting to see where you went with it. Music's aside and time. I think so. And you know the.
Oh, you're right about that. Like I was saying.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to go. Plus the performers. I mean, but the students who are in conservatories now are much more open-minded about that now, and their plans.
Like the student, I mean, we had the Carter thing. The students that play her, I think, were just, you know, Chinese Babbitt. I mean, like, you know, on the Carter thing, we had.
Before you go to Santa Fe. I can survive anything. I know. Yeah, there was some reason I had to move it. I forget why. It goes back to normal next year. Yeah, but it's nice to see you. It was fantastic. See you.
Oh, yeah.